The stage lights were blinding, the air inside the Kennedy Forum heavy with expectation. It was a night meant for dialogue broadcast live across major networks, trending before it even began. They called it Voices of Power, and the lineup was impressive. Senators, artists, economists, cultural icons. But the name that had truly pulled the millions of viewers was Denzel Washington. He wasn't a politician. He'd never run for office or sat on a campaign trail. But he had something no one else on that stage had trust. Over the years, his voice had become more than just that of an actor. It was a voice of dignity, of experience, of pain carried with quiet grace. So when he took the seat far left on the semicircular panel, the crowd leaned forward. Then came Karoline Leavitt. She entered like a flame camera ready, perfectly poised, a smirk already curling her lips. At just 42, she had become one of the fastest-rising names in the American Senate. Blonde, sharp, and fiercely unapologetic, Karoline had built her career not on building bridges, but burning them. Her fans saw her as bold. Her critics saw her as dangerous. Either way, she was ratings gold. From the moment she sat across from Denzel, something in the room shifted. The moderator, a seasoned anchor named Jonathan Marks, introduced the panel's theme. How does America heal? But before he could finish his opening question, Karoline leaned forward. With respect, she said, eyes fixed on Denzel, I think it's time we stop pretending Hollywood actors are the voice of real Americans. The audience murmured. Some laughed nervously. The camera cut to Denzel, who sat still, not blinking. Karoline continued, her voice crisp and sharp. Mr. Washington is a brilliant performer, sure. But let's not confuse well-rehearsed monologues. With lived political reality, the insult was clear. On live television, in front of millions, she had called him irrelevant. Fictional. Just an actor. Still, Denzel didn't speak. He didn't flinch. He simply turned his head and met her gaze with an unreadable calm. The moderator tried to steer the conversation back, asking about racial divisions. Denzel finally spoke, his voice low but firm. When I was 14, he began. My father sat me down and explained what it meant to walk into a room where you weren't welcome. He said, son, speak when you're ready. And make sure it's the truth. His words hung in the air. Soft but weighty. Karoline laughed. Again with the stories, she said. It's beautiful, really, like a movie script. But America's not a film, Mr. Washington. It's tough choices, real numbers, hard truths, not emotional speeches. This time, the audience didn't laugh. Something in her tone had shifted from playful to cold. Denzel took a breath. You're right, he said. America isn't a movie. But some of us have seen scenes you couldn't survive, and we didn't need a camera to know they were real. A hush fell. Karoline shifted in her seat, perhaps realizing she'd pushed too far. The moderator looked from one guest to the other, sensing tension that had nothing to do with policy. What no one knew was that Denzel had a reason for keeping calm. This wasn't the first time he'd crossed paths with the Leavitt family. It went back decades, back to a courtroom in Georgia, back to a time when a judge her father had buried the truth. Denzel's older brother David had been a civil rights lawyer. In 1979, he took on a case that changed everything. A black veteran falsely accused of assaulting a white woman. The judge in charge of that case had blocked evidence, silenced witnesses, and sentenced the man to 15 years. That judge was Harold like Karoline's father. David had fought hard, too hard. The case ruined his career. He died not long after, broken and forgotten. Denzel had never spoken about it publicly, not once, but now, staring into the eyes of the judge's daughter, watching her dismiss pain as performance, something in him began to rise. Not anger, truth. As the panel continued, Karoline's interruptions grew bolder. She twisted his words, framed him as out of touch, mocked his calls for institutional empathy. Then, right before the commercial break, she turned to him and said, "Let's stop pretending. You're just an actor. You pretend for a living. That's all you've ever done." A collective gasp spread through the audience. Even the moderator froze. And then Denzel spoke quietly. "No," he said. "I remember pretending when I was a child, pretending we lived in a fair country, pretending justice was blind. But I stopped pretending when your father put an innocent man in prison. And I stopped forgiving when the truth was buried so his daughter could rise." Karoline's face drained of color. The screen cut to commercial. But the internet exploded, and the real story had just begun. The control room was chaos. Producers barked orders, interns scrambled to mute unplanned microphones. And the floor manager waved frantically at the moderator to keep his composure. But it was too late. The words had already left Denzel's mouth, and they were echoing across a nation. Karoline Leavitt sat frozen, her confident posture collapsing by degrees. She looked straight ahead, refusing to glance at Denzel or the cameras. Her fingers gripped the armrest, knuckles whitening. In homes across America, viewers sat in silence, phones in hand, rewatching the moment over and over. On Twitter, clips of Denzel's statement had already racked up millions of views. Hashtags like hashtag not just an actor and hashtag truth cuts deep began trending within minutes. The show returned from commercial, but the energy had shifted. The moderator tried to regain control. "Let's focus now on systemic trust," he said, forcing a smile. "Senator Leavitt, would you care to respond?" Karoline blinked. "That was a low blow," she said, forcing a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Bringing up personal family history that's even true on a national stage. It's manipulative, and it distracts from real policy." Denzel didn't look at her. He looked into the camera. "I'm not here for politics," he said. "I came to speak about dignity. I came because there are voices that were never heard, men buried under false charges, children raised without fathers, families erased from public memory. If telling that truth makes me manipulative, maybe the lie was more fragile than we thought." The moderator tried again. "Let's shift to community rebuilding," but Karoline wasn't done. Her voice sharpened. "Are you accusing my father of judicial misconduct on television with no proof?" Denzel turned to her then, calm, controlled. "I'm not accusing," he said. "I'm remembering." The silence returned, heavier this time. After the panel ended, backstage corridors buzzed like a hornet's nest. Reporters from CNN, NPR, and Reuters surrounded the exits. Questions flew in all directions. "Mr. Washington, is there a case number?" "Senator Leavitt, was your father investigated for racial bias? Is this personal or political?" Neither of them responded. But the truth didn't wait for permission. That night, an independent journalist named Theo Grayson posted a thread unraveling the 1979 case. It had been buried in dusty court archives in Savannah, Georgia, but the records were there. State of Georgia v. James Tolliver. The defendant, a black veteran, had been convicted with no physical evidence. The judge, Harold Light. The lead defense lawyer, David Washington. The tweets spread like wildfire. By morning, a retired paralegal came forward anonymously to a small online outlet. She claimed that Judge Light had personally ordered transcripts to be sealed. He said it would protect his daughter's future. The woman, now in her 80s, broke down during the recorded interview. "I should have spoken up. But back then, you just didn't." Karoline's office issued a short statement by noon. Senator Light categorically denies all allegations attempting to link her father's judicial decisions to her political career. Mr. Washington's comments are beneath the dignity of serious discourse. But it wasn't enough. Not this time. That afternoon, a student journalist from Howard University dug deeper and uncovered a 1982 campaign memo from Harold Light's failed congressional run. In it, he described the Washington brothers as agitators, dressed as gentlemen. That memo had been quietly erased from Karoline's campaign website just 3 years earlier. Back in Los Angeles, Denzel sat in his home, the TV muted. His phone had rung non-stop, agents and producers begging him to go on the record, do exclusive interviews, make a documentary. He said no to all of them. Instead, he opened a worn-out manila folder inside. Newspaper clippings, letters, court. Sketches, and a photo of David standing outside the courthouse, jaw clenched, eyes tired. A handwritten note on the back read, "They don't have to listen today, but one day they will." Later that evening, Denzel walked out alone to a quiet bench overlooking Laurel Canyon. He dialed a number he hadn't called in years. It rang. Twice. Then a man's voice answered, old but firm. "Washington." "It's time," Denzel said. "I think we open the files." The man hesitated. "You sure? She started this," Denzel replied. "But my brother's going to finish." In D.C., Karoline met with her closest advisors. Her communications director was pale, holding a printout of the leaked documents. "We need to get ahead of this," she said. "We either admit what's true or they'll define the truth for us." Karoline slammed her hand on the table. "I will not apologize for my father. He was a war hero and a judge. And I will not be lectured by an actor trying to rewrite history for sympathy. But history was already rewriting itself." And this time, the cameras were still rolling. The rain hit the marble steps of Capitol Hill like a slow drumbeat as reporters gathered outside Karoline Leavitt's office. Dozens of cameras waited for a press statement that never came. Inside, the mood was tense. Her staff moved quietly, eyes down, voices low. Something had cracked, and no one could deny it anymore. But the real storm wasn't outside. It was online. Theo Grayson's investigative thread had reached over 12 million views. Every detail was cited: court documents, sealed memos, copies of erased campaign pages recovered through archive tools. Hashtags like #LaEatCoverUp and #JusticeForTolliver dominated platforms. Even mainstream outlets, CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera were now calling it a judicial scandal decades in the making. But it wasn't just digital outrage. Something more powerful had surfaced. Testimony. A man named Marcus Tolliver, son of James Tolliver. The veteran wrongfully convicted in 1979 stepped forward. He appeared on an independent podcast the next morning. His voice trembled at first. "They said my father attacked a woman," Marcus began. "He was working 2 jobs and attending night school. They never looked for truth, just needed someone to blame. Judge Light gave them what they wanted." He paused, then added, "I was 6. My mother never recovered, and no one believed us." Asked how he felt about Denzel speaking up, Marcus's voice steadied. He didn't just speak, he remembered. And that's more than anyone ever did. The interview exploded. Donations poured in to reopen the case. Civil rights groups announced plans to file for posthumous exoneration. A new legal team formed around Marcus. Half were former students of David Washington, the brother who once fought the same battle and lost. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, Denzel stayed silent. He declined every request for comment. Instead, he met privately with Samira Kantha, only journalist he trusted. She was young, sharp, and had spent years covering racial bias in legal systems. She arrived at his home with just a notebook and a recorder. "I don't want to be the center of this," Denzel said, walking her through a small study filled with court files and old photos. "I want you to tell his story." "My brother's. Tolliver's, not mine." Samira nodded. "But people are listening to you." "They're listening to the truth," he said. "For now." As they talked, Denzel handed her something: an old VHS tape. It was unmarked. That's from 1980, he said. David filmed it after he lost the Tolliver case. He said one day someone might need to see it. Samira's hands shook as she took it. She left that night with a promise to show it unedited. The next evening, Samira aired the footage on her independent news platform. It was grainy and flickering, but David Washington's face filled the screen. They took the truth, he said, into the camera and buried it beneath robes and rules. But this country, this system, it only works when we remember the names they tried to erase. James Tolliver. Remember him? The internet lit up again. Thousands of comments. Letters to editors. Student. Walkouts. Law schools began hosting panels about racial judicial abuse, using the Tolliver case as a new model of systemic failure. Under pressure, Karoline released a second statement. This time, she showed emotion. "I loved my father," she said. "He was complicated, strong, and flawed. I do not believe he acted with hatred, but I now recognize that he may have failed in delivering full justice. I am sorry to anyone who was hurt by those decisions, but it wasn't enough." Reporters unearthed audio from a 2012 campaign dinner where she had mocked civil rights leaders as professional victims. Her carefully managed persona began to crumble. Even her own party members distanced themselves. A senator from Oregon tweeted, "Justice delayed must not be denied. We must investigate the Light case in full." Still, Karoline didn't resign. Instead, she booked a primetime interview one-on-one with a friendly anchor on national television. Her plan was clear: reclaim control, reset the narrative, cast herself as misunderstood. But something happened before the interview. AIREDA second tape surface.samira had found it in the bottom of Denzel's file box. This one wasn't from David, it was from the original courtroom audio leaked by an anonymous source. It captured Judge Light dismissing Tolliver's alibi, mocking his war service, and refusing to admit critical evidence. And then came the worst part: a sentence. From the judge's own mouth, "I'd rather convict one innocent man than let 10 radicals walk free." The quote ran on every front page the next day. Karoline's interview never aired. Instead, the network ran a breaking news special, "The Truth About Judge Light." And across the country, the question changed. It wasn't, did Karoline know? It was, how much did she help cover up? The Capitol was quieter than usual that morning. It wasn't just the rain or the heavy gray clouds drifting over the dome. It was the silence inside, like something sacred had been broken. In the Senate chamber, Karoline Leavitt sat alone in her office, staring at the wood-paneled walls. Her advisors had stopped pushing statements. Her legal team was now focused on survival. Across the city, a different kind of energy buzzed inside a cramped editing room where Samira Khan stared at the raw courtroom tape on her laptop. No filters, no cuts, just history playing out in crackling. "Mono," the judge's voice, stern, cold, final, declaring, "I'd rather convict one innocent man than let 10 radicals walk free." Samira closed the file and leaned back. She knew this wasn't just about exposing a man who had died decades ago. It was about a system that had allowed him to become powerful in the first place, and a daughter who had inherited more than just his name that same day. Samira aired a special broadcast, 3 minutes of footage showing pieces of the 1979 trial. She narrated softly over it, her voice solemn. This wasn't a courtroom. It was a stage. But the script was written by power, not justice. Viewers around the world watched in disbelief. The story was now global. The BBC compared it to South Africa's Truth Commissions. Le Monde wrote, "An actor unmasks America's forgotten sins." In Nigeria, political columnist called it one of the most profound unravelings of U.S. racial history on live television. And at the center of it, Denzel Washington, who hadn't spoken publicly in over a week. But that didn't mean he wasn't working behind the scenes. Denzel had gathered a quiet coalition of civil rights lawyers, retired judges, professors, and journalists. They met discreetly at his home in Los Angeles. Their mission to create a legal and historical archive on the Tolliver case and others like it. What began as a single conversation had turned into a multi-state investigation. Several old cases from the light courtroom were reopened. Whistleblowers stepped forward, former clerks, secretaries, and one ex-police officer who confessed to falsifying testimony under pressure. Denzel watched it unfold from a distance, never demanding credit. "This isn't about bringing Karoline down," he told Samira. "It's about pulling truth up." Meanwhile, Karoline faced her first formal inquiry. A bipartisan ethics committee launched an investigation into her concealment of judicial misconduct during her Senate campaign. Documents showed that she had been briefed in 2014 about her father's problematic rulings, but chose to seal and archive them in a private family trust, away from public access. She defended herself by saying, "I wasn't covering it up. I was protecting my family's privacy." But the public wasn't convinced. At a protest outside her office, a young black student held up a sign that read, "We were never given privacy from injustice." That image ran on the front page of the New York Times the next morning. Marcus Tolliver, now the soft-spoken face of the movement, took to the podium at a rally in Atlanta. His voice was calm, but it carried. "They erased my father's name. They erased his dignity. And now we rewrite the record. Not with vengeance, but with truth." Cheers erupted. Tears flowed. For the first time in decades, James Tolliver's name was being honored, not just as a victim, but as a man who deserved to be remembered. Back in Washington, a leaked memo from Karoline's staff suggested they had considered blaming Denzel for political ambush. But the backlash to even floating that idea was instant and brutal. One late-night host joked, trying to discredit Denzel. "That's like trying to punch the moon." Karoline canceled all public appearances. Even members of her own party stopped returning her calls. The ethics inquiry moved forward, but something deeper was shifting. Americans, especially young people, started digging. They looked into old trials, old judges, old laws. Hashtags turned into petitions. Petitions turned into local campaigns. A senator from Illinois proposed the Tolliver Justice Act, calling for full review boards on racially biased rulings from 1950 to 1990. Denzel received a private invitation to the Senate floor for the bill's first reading. He declined on instead. He sent a letter, handwritten, "I will not stand in the halls that silenced men like James Tolliver. I will not smile for cameras in buildings where verdicts were traded like favors. But I will watch from afar with hope that what we write today is worth reading tomorrow." And when Samira read that letter aloud on air, something changed. Not just policies, consciousness. The truth had taken root, and it was growing. The sun rose slowly over Washington, D.C., but it didn't bring warmth. The chill in the air mirrored the unease inside the Capitol. Karoline Leavitt arrived through the staff entrance, head lowered, flanked by two silent aides. The building had once echoed with her confident heels. Today, it echoed with whispers and judgment. At precisely 10 a.m., the Senate Ethics Committee began its closed-door hearing. No cameras, no press. Just 7 senators, a legal panel, and Karoline Leavitt facing the weight of her father's past stand, her own choices. For years, she had built a public image of discipline, strength, and reform. But now the words concealment, obstruction, and abuse of power were being read aloud next to her name. Her answers were careful, too careful. When asked why she sealed her father's court records, she replied, "To protect the memory of a good man who served his country." When asked if she knew about racial bias in his rulings, she paused. "I knew there were controversies, but no formal convictions, no criminal investigations." But the panel wasn't just armed with documents. They had a witness, Samira Khan. She took the stand with her usual calm, hair tied back, a notepad in hand. She wasn't just a journalist now, she was a primary source. She spoke of Denzel's files, of the VHS tapes, of the former paralegal who confirmed the sealing order was meant to secure Karoline's political future. She presented dates, names, and court-stamped evidence. Her voice never shook. Karoline watched her like a stranger. Like the story had slipped out of her hands and become something else, bigger, heavier, impossible to stop. Outside the Capitol, protesters gathered again. Some held portraits of James Tolliver in uniform. Others carried banners that read, "The truth is not partisan." In Atlanta, Marcus Tolliver spoke again, this time on the steps of the federal courthouse. "My father's dignity was stolen in that courtroom," he said. "But today, we stand in a court of conscience. And that has no political party." In Los Angeles, Denzel watched the broadcast alone. He didn't call anyone, didn't post online. He simply nodded. Then he opened a box that had sat unopened for decades. Inside were letters written by his brother David during the Tolliver trial. Most were legal drafts, strategy notes, outlines of appeals that never made it. But one stood out, a letter never sent. It was addressed to Harold Light. "I know who you are. And I know what you did. You wear a robe, but you use it like a sword. You don't fear law, you fear memory. Someone will remember. And when they do, I hope they speak louder than I could." Denzel read it twice, then folded it gently and placed it on his desk. He didn't need to speak louder. The world was doing that now. That evening, a surprise broadcast aired on national television. A special edition of American Reckoning, hosted by Samira. Titled "The Actor and the Judge." It featured voices from all sides: civil rights historians, former court staff, Karoline's old professors, and even one of her former speechwriters, who resigned weeks earlier. The episode ended with an audio recording a never-before-heard voicemail left by David, Washington, shortly before his death. "You may never hear me, but I'll keep talking. I'll keep naming names, writing letters, and walking into rooms where they want me quiet. Because silence is what built these walls. And truth is what will bring them down." The country sat in stunned silence after it aired. Even those who once supported Karoline began to question everything. A conservative columnist wrote, "Perhaps we've been cheering the wrong kind of strength. Maybe real courage isn't about never apologizing, but about owning the cost of truth." Inside the Senate, pressure mounted. Karoline's aides began resigning one by one. The Ethics Committee report leaked. Its language was clear. Senator Light knowingly withheld evidence of judicial misconduct, thereby misleading both the electorate and congressional investigators. That night, Karoline finally spoke again. A private recording, not meant for press, captured her in a meeting with her last remaining senior aide. "They were never supposed to find it," she whispered. "It was buried." The aide asked, "What now?" Karoline stared out the window. "Now I wait to see if silence still works in this country." But silence no longer worked. Not when millions had found their voice. Not when the man she called just an actor had become the conscience of a nation. The resignation came not with a press conference, but with a single email sent to all major news networks at exactly 6 a.m. It was short, clinical, and cold, effective. "Immediately, I, Karoline Light, resign from the United States Senate. I do so without admission of wrongdoing, but in acknowledgement that my presence has become a distraction from the work of governance. This decision is mine alone. No apology, no reflection, no truth." But by the time that email was read aloud on national television, it didn't matter. Karoline Light had already left the city. Her townhouse was empty, her social media accounts deleted, her staff unreachable. The woman who had once been the sharpest voice in American politics had vanished in less than 24 hours, and the world barely blinked at Howard University. Students gathered in the courtyard to celebrate the news. They read aloud passages from David Washington's old legal writings, printed on banners and posters. A new mural was unveiled, James Tolliver in his Army uniform, next to a young black boy holding his hand captioned with David's words, "Truth doesn't beg to be remembered, it demands it." At the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History, a special exhibit opened quietly, the Tolliver Kaisa Legacy Buried and Unearthed. Visitors formed long lines. Some left flowers beneath a display case holding David's original court files. Children pressed their palms against the glass, reading every word. Samira Khan stood in front of that glass one morning, silently filming the scene. She didn't say much, but when a boy asked her, "Is the actor coming today?" she smiled gently and said, "He already did." Denzel Washington had withdrawn completely from public view. No interviews, no speeches, no award shows. His home in Laurel Canyon remained quiet. The gates locked, thought he was finished with Hollywood. Others said he had nothing left to prove. Karoline Leavitt didn't resign, not yet. Instead, she vanished. No press appearances, no Senate floor votes. Her office issued short, procedural updates. The senator is reviewing the ethics committee's findings, but no one believed them. In Washington, power doesn't just disappear. It retreats when it knows the next strike might be fatal. But silence didn't slow the wave. Protests turned into policy. The Tolliver Justice Act passed its first hurdle with bipartisan support. It proposed the establishment of a National Review Board to investigate wrongful convictions from 1950 to 1990, specifically those connected to judges flagged for racial bias. It was the first bill of its kind in U.S. history, and its face wasn't a politician. It was Denzel Washington. Not in person, he still refused all interviews. But his name came up in every floor speech, every town hall, every student-led rally. College campuses across the country hosted screenings of The Actor and the Judge, Samira's investigative special. Law students wrote essays on David Washington's unfinished legal work. History professors redesigned their curriculum to include the Tolliver case as a landmark in legal accountability. But the most powerful change happened in homes. Families that had never talked about injustice started talking. Parents explained words like bias, legacy, and systemic. High schoolers asked their teachers who James Tolliver was. Denzel had not shouted. He had simply told the truth, and that was enough to stir something the country hadn't felt in years. Reflection in Atlanta. Marcus Tolliver was invited to speak before the Judiciary Committee. He stood with steady hands and a clear voice. "My father didn't just lose freedom," he said. "He lost memory. They erased him so they could protect people like Judge Light, so that his daughter could one day stand here in this very building, claiming to speak for justice. But now, the truth has spoken for him." The room gave him a standing ovation. Meanwhile, Karoline remained out of sight, but her inner circle had collapsed. Her chief of staff resigned quietly. Her communications director released a tell-all interview. She knew, the director said. She knew about the sealed cases. She read the letters. She believed that if she ignored them long enough, they'd disappear. But Denzel didn't let that happen. Behind closed doors, Karoline began reaching out to former allies. It's called governors, donors, and media figures, hoping for support. Few answered. Those who did were cold. Her name was now political poison. Her ambitions of a presidential run, once whispered with comforts, were now mocked on late-night television. Then came the subpoena. A formal summons to testify under oath before the Ethics Committee, this time publicly. The date was set. July 20th. Cameras would roll. America would watch. Denzel received the news while sitting with Samira in a quiet garden behind his home. She handed him the headline. He didn't react. "She lie," Samira said. "Maybe," Denzel replied. "But the truth will still be in the room." Samira looked at him. "Will you be there?" He shook his head. "No, I've done my part." The rest is for the world to decide. Later that evening, Denzel went into his study and pulled out one last letter. This one was addressed not to a judge or a senator, but to Marcus. I stewed because your father couldn't. You speak now because mine couldn't. Keep walking, keep speaking. And when they ask who James Tulliver was, tell them he was a man who didn't get justice, but gave birth to it. He signed it simply D.W. across the ocean. In a BBC documentary titled The Actor Who Spoke Truth, a historian summed it up best. This was never about Denzel Washington. It was about what happens when someone refuses to let silence win. On July 20th, as America waited for Karoline Leavitt to take the oath, the streets outside the Capitol filled with people not with chants, but with quiet, a silence no longer shaped by fear, but by memory.